When I wrote the script to this video, the title was Genealogy of the Holy War's Prologue is a terrific opening to a terrible game. I abandoned that title for a couple of reasons. The first is that I don't want to inspire the wrath of Link King and Choop Nasty and Mecha and everyone. Also, I don't go into depth about my holistic thoughts on genealogy. Instead, I do something I've never done publicly, which is talk very highly of genealogy. This video is a sequel to my November classic, How Fire Emblem Designs First Chapters, and the most common request I got after that video was to do a sequel talking about the games that I skipped over, notably Binding Blade, Radiant Dawn, and Genealogy of the Holy War. After looking at ways to construct a follow-up video without it suffering from sequelitis, I decided that genealogy is a beast that must be contained. Originally, I left it out because this game is so radically different from the other games in the series with how it must teach its players to play. Outside of the grid-based, turn-based combat, everything from money, item management, the love system, talk conversations, thievery, inheritance, the arena, and even series mainstays like Doublink and Critical Hits function differently from their other incarnations in the franchise or are entirely unique to genealogy. This is a lot that the game is asked to teach the player, and the remarkable part to me is that in a game defined by bloat, the prologue, Birth of a Crusader, is one of the tightest, most well-paced, and exciting maps in the entire series, and is my pick for the best map during the Shozukaga era. This video will look at how well this prologue teaches new players the mechanics of Fire Emblem and of Genealogy of the Holy War specifically. It will also expand beyond that to look at how artfully this chapter tells a gameplay story. I should be clear that I do not mean the actual narrative of the game, which I will only briefly refer to. As this chapter rolls out, the player is given control of 4 characters: the Chad Sigurd, the Virgin Noish, the Green Unit Alec, and Arthritic Arden. It's a ragtag group that gives an exciting opening to the map. This is an understaffed and under-resourced army that is immediately on a crunch. The castle south at Youngby is being sieged, and the villages out west are being razed to the ground. The player is immediately forced to split their attention and has to split the army in 2 parts. One half to save the villages, and the other to stop the castle siege. Outside of the chapter's introductory dialogue priming players to do this, the map is also designed in such a way to push players to split their forces. While there is no timer on seizing Youngby Castle, there is a village right beside it, setting an effective timer on the player to reach the castle and begin working over the brigands looting the castle. On the first turn, there is only one enemy nearby the starting point. This axe bro can be annihilated in 1 round by Sigurd or perfectly comboed by Alec and Noish. Whatever the player does, it sets into motion the split in the army. Even if the player doesn't immediately split up on turn 1, the villages being beset upon will force the player to make the call to split their army by turn 2. Psychologically, the player is going to want to do this. The game's story primes this by Sigurd and pals saying their mission is to save the villages and to save the castle. Also, players aren't going to be conditioned to be scared of playing fast and aggressively. For one, villages are being burned down. There is no choice but to be aggressive. But also, the priming that the game does encourages aggression. Sigurd is on a mission to repel invaders from his homeland. The enemies are mostly inaccurate, die very quickly, and look simply pathetic and drab compared to Sigurd. They slowly waddle toward you and gracelessly swing, while Sigurd leaps with his mighty steed and clobbers the fuck out of them. This positively reinforces the idea of pushing forward. Even though Alec and Noish aren't nearly as flashy or powerful as Sigurd, their combined might can handily deal with the enemies early on in this map. Sigurd, however, is the one who can massacre enemies, and that is quickly established. The northern half of this map is sparsely populated by enemies, while the southern half is packed with hordes of brigands. This incentivizes the player to send Sigurd south, either by himself or with another unit as backup. This is good because Sigurd is needed to seize the castle, and because it sets into motion the most well-told intra-map story in the series. Let's zoom out on this map. Here's the arc that the chapter follows. Group 1, led by Sigurd, begins pushing south towards Youngby, while Group 2, led by Alec, Noish, or both, pushes west to save the villages. Even if the player doesn't decide to split their army and sends everyone south, 2 new characters come from the north on turn 2, Lex and Azel. This means that no matter what, there will be a split storyline between the northern and southern halves of this map. Besides, if the player hasn't yet split the army, the arrival of Lex and Azel forces the player's hand. Lex and Azel are outnumbered, and while they can handle themselves, the fact that neither is particularly tanky or dodgy means that a player is likely going to be driving one of their cavaliers out west if they haven't already. This is the first act of the map, with the player generally in control, but the situation is likely going to quickly deteriorate. On turn 2 enemy phase, the southern army is likely to get swamped by the massive hordes of enemies. Despite the low hit rates, enough of these attacks are going to land to put the player back on their heels. Even Sigurd will begin to be at risk, but the chapter is built for the likely chance that Sigurd and pals will begin to feel the heat around turn 3. From the castle where Sigurd began his journey, 3 new units ride in to provide backup to Sigurd: Quan, Finn, and the healer Ethlin. It becomes a dash as these 3 are split up to drive out west and down south to aid the player's strained forces. Out west, there are churches that can fully heal characters to help the player survive until backup arrives, and down south there are a couple of forests expertly placed so that Sigurd can neatly reach them by turn 3 so that he faces incredibly low hit rates, many at 0%, as he waits for Ethlin, Finn, or Quan. The villages in the northwest and center of the map invites the player to send Lex and pals way past their breaking points, and the glob of enemies surrounding Youngby means that the gambit to take back the castle will be a daring one, even once Sigurd gets back up from the Quan squad. It's at this point that the player is at their lowest. The army is fractured, hurt, and once Youngby is seized, Castle Verdane pours out a new horde of enemies. They will likely encounter the army before everyone can fully regroup. However, this is where the third act of this chapter begins. The army, being patched up by the churches and Ethlin, starts clashing with the Verdane forces. Soon, a new character, Arvis, arrives from the north. He says that he needs to see Sigurd, and once he converges with Sigurd, he hands him a new silver sword, a powerful weapon that absolutely annihilates every remaining enemy on the map. The final clash occurs around the choke point of the bridge. Enemies will likely come out of the east side of the bridge, but since they're all low move enemies, the mostly mounted and highly mobile player army will be able to push them back and choke them out on the bridge. The map ends with the army pouring into Castle Verdane and triumphantly ending the invasion into their homeland. That was a mouthful, but summarizing the chapter that way reveals some insights into how this map is built and what makes it so powerful. The split army during most of the map creates an effect very similar to cross-cutting in movies, which is where scenes are edited together to give the illusion that they are happening simultaneously. These two stories, the mission to save the villages and the castle siege, are separate, yet are connected by being two parts of the player's efforts to save the land. They each have their own drama, but because it's one army being stretched thin, everything weaves together to create an intense experience for the player. The other key part is that the split army is organic. Even though the map pushes the player to do this and even pulls some shenanigans with Lex and Azel appearing in the north, the call to split the army is ultimately the player's decision, and each half of the army will experience their own story with their own goals. Compare this to Chapter 22 of Binding Blade or Chapter 18 of Crimson Flower. In Binding Blade, your two halves are smashing through enemies to reach 2 points to reconverge at the throne room. It's fine initially, but the pacing is terrible as the right army will be quickly left with nothing to do as the left army winds down the unnecessarily bending hallways on their side. Both halves of Edelgard's army are going to be driving straight up towards the final boss, but more than likely the player will just immediately converge the two armies together because they're only separated by about 1 turn's worth of space. The multiple storylines happening during Birth of a Crusader are unique, organic, and constantly moving. Part of that is trickery from behind the scenes. Lex and Azel will force the player west if they didn't initially break that way, and holding back your first healer until turn 3 places additional stresses on your forces that aren't there during the rest of the game. This steady stream of new units, including getting Dark Eater Midir,
What is that? What is he doing? Is that a laser? Is that a laser? Is he shooting a fucking laser at me? Oh my god.
the game's easy button when you save Youngby, also creates momentum and keeps the ebb and flow of this chapter sharp and constantly moving. This is a luxury that Birth of the Crusader has that other chapters don't, since at no other point are you given this many characters during one chapter. But regardless, the split army scenario that results in multiple simultaneous storylines never really happens during the rest of the game. Look at later chapters in the game and map out the likely path that many new players are going to follow. That's a lot of winding back around. Most villages are on the natural path that the player will follow. While an experienced player will know all about the different divergent paths mini-maps like Chapter 2 will follow, a first playthrough matters, and much of a blind playthrough will be dominated by sweeping your army across swaths of empty land. It also doesn't help that many maps bottleneck players with terrain, which is just frustrating on a first playthrough because it often stops progress right in its tracks rather than presenting unique scenarios. Chapters 1 and 4 are particularly guilty of this. The moments where these later chapters excel almost always comes from new units arriving. Lewin and Sylvia in Chapter 2, and Brigid, Teal'chu, and Claude in Chapter 3. These create interesting situations, but these stories almost never synergize with the rest of the story and can't change the amount of nothing that a new player is likely going to experience with their main forces. While most of Genealogy is a thesis on the virtues of tight, refined map design, Birth of a Crusader shows what the epic scale of Genealogy is capable of and what Fire Emblem maps can be when they carefully control for player resources and intelligently map out side objectives. One can only imagine how good a Fire Emblem game could be if it combined this type of effective large map design with the tight, intimate storylines of maps like the Manster arc from Thracia 776. This ambition has only ever really been pursued by Radiant Dawn, and that's a real shame. But the game must be played to experience this story, so how well does Birth of a Crusader teach a blind player to approach Genealogy's gameplay? Quite well, actually, and this was surprising to me because of how complex Genealogy is. The key to Birth of a Crusader is that it keeps everything simple. There is no item management, no arena, no indication of love points. Everything is basic. The seizes of Youngby and Verdane establish the core gameplay loop of the game, which is attack castle, seize with Sigurd, move on to the next. Rescue villages to get money and items. You can use terrain to boost your survivability. Lex and Azel start right next to a glob of forests, and there's a nicely placed forest near Youngby that I mentioned earlier. Because there's no trading items like a traditional Fire Emblem game, the player is going to use all of their resources, and hoarding is disincentivized since there's literally no choice but to use your current gear. All of that is pretty simple mechanically, and getting those simple lessons into players' heads isn't the biggest onus on this map. The big challenge is how to introduce those complicated, unique genealogy features. Like I said, this map keeps it simple, but it also takes an hour to complete. There needs to be concrete lessons about how genealogy specifically works. The biggest difference between Genealogy and every other Fire Emblem game is the money management system. This is the most complicated and most necessary component of being able to complete Genealogy. The arena is self-explanatory, and love points, while cool, are not necessary to beat the game. The second half of the game gives you enough Omega Chads in Seliph, Oiphi, Shannon, Finn, and Leaf to be able to complete the game without having to fully engage in the love or inheritance system. But money. Money is different. Every unit has their own pool of money, and they have to dip into that pool to buy new weapons, repair their good ones, and buy the stat boosters they need. Every item in Genealogy is permanent, and weapons are limited. There is no trading, just buying and selling from the pawn shop to move items around, and the blacksmith to repair your weapons and staves. Money is the mechanic that new players need to learn, and Birth of a Crusader has a decent way of teaching new players that each character has their own gold reserve that must be utilized. Saving villages gives money to the rescuing character, but the first opportunity to spend comes from the churches. The man in one of the villages notes that you can spend money to stay in the church for a full heal. It's a minuscule amount, and this primer will get players to pay attention to the gold stat on the unit screen and will likely cause them to notice that it's different between each character. However, this isn't foolproof. If a player never checks the stat screen or is particularly stingy and never visits a church, they will never notice that gold is different between each character. A possible solution would be to have the silver sword Arvis gifts Sigurd be broken, with Arvis instructing Sigurd to fix it at Castle Verdane and handing him the cash to do so. This would introduce money and weapon repair without forcing a long-winded and fourth-wall-breaking tutorial on the player. That Arvis conversation is actually pretty clutch as well, because what it does is introduce that characters can have optional talk conversations between each other that can reward the player with new goodies. There is also a talk conversation between Ethlyn and Sigurd, which is a clever combo since Ethlyn is the healer. She is the one character guaranteed to stop on an adjacent spot next to characters, so the player is going to see the talk option pop up at some point during the chapter. Whew. Well, that's about it for me today. Maybe one day I'll make that big video about my misgivings with Genealogy of the Holy War, but I can't deny that in replaying its prologue, Birth of a Crusader has become my personal pick for the best map in any Fire Emblem, or at least of the ones that are going for an epic scale. It's got split objectives, mixed storylines, player agency driving the story, and is tight, snappy, and well-paced despite its length. Stay tuned, and I'll be back next time for some hot critique. See you all then. Before I go, I'd like to give a quick shout out to everyone who has supported this channel through Patreon, including Thomas G. Grow, T-Claus45, No Offense, Little Beats, Dabney, Anton Nielsen, Salty Prime, Stephanie Roman, Shingzhen, Neo Sigma, Nathaniel Peters, Major, E-Dub, Bessapedal, A.L. Mandite, Will Brock, Estajuice, Zooplord, Uther 007, That Icarus Kid, Sea Salt Boy, Pengus Khan, Nin, Henry G, Exod, Dector A, Chris Geddes, Kate Rose, BMO McGrim, Ascended Bagels, Anime Go Go Go, and Alex Edgar. Thank you all so much for your support.